Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Elected Officials to Protect America for our policy webinar on the development of offshore wind in California. EOPA is a national network of current and former elected officials who care deeply about protecting our planet and democracy by working together to transition to a clean energy economy. EOPA educates and trains lawmakers through values-based storytelling. We have a national and state-based programs where we work to implement bold policy solutions to solve the climate crisis with environmental justice for all. My name is Megan Sally Wells. I am happy to facilitate this conversation. I'm the California Director of EOPA and the former mayor of Culver City. Working closely with community partners, my biggest accomplishment in my 8 years in office as a council member and mayor was to stop all new oil and gas drilling and begin to phase out existing drilling in Culver City. And later partnered with champions in LA County and LA City to do the same. At the same time, Culver City successfully transitioned to 100% renewable energy in 2019. So not only did we help stop the extraction of the fossil fuels that were poisoning our community, but we also worked hard to make our community independent from those fossil fuels. And we're not alone. We've seen state leadership step up with California's goal of reaching 100% renewable energy for the entire state by 2045. These are all huge legislative achievements, but they'll only be meaningful if we can deliver on the clean, renewable energy that our state needs. Now, the good news is that offshore wind has the potential to be the biggest lever that we can pull to reduce our emissions, address the climate crisis, meet our energy needs, and grow our economy simultaneously. It's poised to become a $1 trillion industry by 2040. As leaders and policymakers, we have an extraordinary opportunity to change the status quo and co-create an energy sector modeled on sustainability, respect for communities and the natural world, affordability, and shared abundance. EOPA is proud to support the responsible, equitable build-out of offshore wind. And we have a growing list of over 100 Californian elected officials who've signed on to our EOPA California Offshore Wind letter. So I have a call to action. I know we've just begun, but if you haven't done so already, I'd ask you to please click the link that's being shared with you and add your name to our letter right now to support offshore wind. And I know some folks are also joining us from other states. I welcome everybody to sign on to our national climate emergency letter, which will be shared with you as well. Okay, it's a great honor to present this panel today and have this conversation about challenges and opportunities of offshore wind from diverse perspectives. So together, we can get this right. We'll hear from Dr. Habib Dagher, Advanced Structures and Composites Center at the University of Maine, from Mike Wilson, the Humboldt County Supervisor and California Coastal Commissioner. We have Councilmember Phillip Williams, who represents the Yurok tribe, and Mayor Eduardo Martinez from Richmond. We'll leave some questions for Q&A at the end. Please feel free, even right now, to put your questions in the Q&A and section at any time. I'm now very happy to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Habib Dagher, who assembled and led a team that deployed the Volturn US 1.8, the first grid-connected floating offshore wind turbine in the United States. The success of this technology led to over 40 patents, a further 150 million in investment from the DOE, and two of the world's largest offshore wind developers. Dr. Habib, we are so happy and honored that you're joining us today.
Thank you, Megan. It's a great pleasure to be here with you from the state of Maine, right at the opposite corner of the country. And I'm gonna go ahead and share the presentation I have on the screen here. You're able to see my my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm going to talk today about floating wind. For those of you who haven't really done digging into floating wind, I hope you come out of this presentation understanding what a floating wind turbine looks like, how it works, what we're doing in Maine about it, what's going on around the world about it. So these are the three things I'll talk about. This is one example of a floating turbine. Basically think of it as a ship holding up a turbine. It floats over the water. The ship is moored to the seabed with mooring lines and anchors and holds up the turbine. Now, to give you a sense of scale, this is a floating turbine. And if you see where my cursor is, can you all see my cursor? Yeah. And
Yes.
there's a school bus there. Okay. That gives you a sense of scale what these turbines look like. So this is not a tiny thing. They're large. The biggest turbines available in the world today, they're operating are 16 megawatts, and each blade is 1 1/3 football field long. So 2 blades, a rotor would be more than 2.5 football fields in diameter. So this is a very, very big unit we're talking about. Now notice that in this, it floats over the water. What makes it float? I'll talk about that in just a minute. So I'll tell you about who we are, why floating wind, how do you engineer a floating wind turbine, why does it float, how does it float, what we've done in Maine with floating wind, and what are the opportunities and challenges that we see with floating wind. The good news is 15 years ago, people thought, many of us researchers who worked on floating wind were not completely with it. A year ago, or this last year, the federal government declared floating wind as the next US Earthshot, meaning it's a key technology to meet as well as our energy goals. The federal government's goal is to reach 15 gigawatts of floating wind by 2035 in the US and reduce the cost of floating wind by 70%. This is our research center at the University of Maine. We're the largest university-based research center in Maine. We have, and to give you a sense of facilities we have in there to move offshore wind forward, this is an example of a wind blade test facility that we have, that's how we test wind blades to make sure they'll hold up 20 and 30 years offshore. And notice the blade is long enough that it could almost hit the ceiling in this particular facility, but you can run that for about 2 months and replicate 20 to 30 years of life. This is a wind wave basin facility that we built to test floating turbines at scale, essentially shrink the turbine size and use the laws of physics to replicate what the motions offshore. So we apply wind loads and wave loads in this facility together, create storms, and figure out how these wind turbines behave under 50 and 500 year storms and so on. And to show you what that actually looks like, this is how we create waves in a wave wind basin facility. And you could see the wind being created out there. And you'll see in just a minute a wind turbine being subjected to a 50-year storm in this particular case. And this is scaled at 150 scale of a full-size unit, but that gives us enough data to prove that it works in the long run. What's the potential for floating wind in the US? Why do we need floating wind? When the water depth is more than about 300 feet, it becomes too costly to fix the turbine to the seabed, so you'd have to float it. If you look at around the United States, the areas in dark blue are deep waters that require floating wind. And you could see in California, it's all dark blue. So you really need, the only option you got is you got floating wind. On the East Coast, there are some areas in light blue where you can use fixed bottom turbines. But the Gulf of Maine where we live is all dark blue, as you see here. So Maine and California share something very much in common. We have deep waters and we have to use floating wind. And Now, on the East Coast, there's a lot of shallow water areas, and there's a lot of projects right now on the East Coast to use fixed bottom turbines nearer to the shore off the coast of New England, as well as the mid-Atlantic states. And the goal in the US is to put 30 gigawatts of fixed bottom wind on the East Coast by 2030. And that would be about $100 billion investment and will create an estimated 44,000 jobs. But let's go back to floating wind. How many floating wind projects are there around the world? As of June of this year, there was roughly about 121 gigawatts of floating wind projects in different forms of development. Nothing built yet. There's only a few demonstration projects out there, but that's a lot, 121 gigawatts. That's roughly $500 billion investment. And there are only a few floating projects around the world right now. Some exist and some are planned. These are typically smaller projects, usually a single turbine or up to 5 or to 6 or 7 turbines. And you can see where they are around the world, where some are planned. One of them is off the coast of Maine. We call it the Maine Research Array. What do floating turbines look like? There's over 100 different designs of floating turbines today, but they're inspired from oil and gas rigs that float in the ocean. So essentially, the engineers have taken oil and gas rigs and modified the design so you can hold up a wind turbine on them. These are floating oil and gas rigs. And you can see how many different designs are out there. The one that was developed in Maine is in the center there. It's made out of concrete, and you can fabricate it locally. These are, but there are, even though there's a lot of different designs, there are only 4 families of designs of floating wind. The one that we're using in Maine is called the semi-submersible. It's in the center. It's this one right here. Can you see my cursor at all?
Oh, I saw it a second ago. Yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, so this here is a what we call a semi-submersible. What it has 3 flotation columns that have air in them, and that what holds up the turbine. And then it's moored to the seabed with mooring lines and anchors. Now, this design is called the spar design. It's like a big floating tube. It's got a mast at the very bottom of the tube that keeps it right up, but the tube's full of air with a mast at the bottom that makes it stay right up. It's as if you took a can of Pepsi and put some sand at the bottom and have it full of air, and you put it in the water, it'll stand up. And that's what a spar design looks like, but it's still moved to the seabed. There's another design called the tension leg platform that has essentially a submerged
the sound
vessel.
Cut out for me real quick. Was that me or was that everybody?
Place.
And that wants to pop out of the water, but you have tension legs that keeps it connected to the seabed. But there are challenges in California for floating wind. The good news is you had a very successful bone lease auction here not too long ago, so that's a great step forward. But California has very deep waters compared to Maine and other places, 1,000 meters or more, 3,000 feet. That adds costs. And there's been no demonstration project in the world that had deep waters like this yet. So we've got to contend with deep waters in California and developing mooring lines and systems that will work in these different environments. Typically, a mooring line has a mooring anchor at the end of it. There's different types of anchors you could use depending on what kind of soils you have. The most common one used is called the drag anchor. It looks like a plow that you drag onto the seabed, and it embeds itself into the seabed. And the shape of the plow allows it to dig into the water. But there's other designs out there. You can use dead weights, you can use driven piles, you can use suction piles, and so on. You also have earthquakes to contend with in California. And we all have issues in the US that we don't have port facilities specifically designed for floating wind. And California, I know, is looking at different port facilities, so is Maine, to allow us to move this industry forward. The other big issue is the supply chain. If California wants 45 or 35 gigawatts by 2045 of floating wind, we're going to have to develop a local supply chain for that, and that's not simple. That needs to be done in time to get to these projects that we need to build on time. You also have deep water, so substations offshore need to float or need to be put at the seabed, and that's also a technology that's still under development. Now, the other thing that's going on is turbines are getting bigger and bigger. The biggest turbine available today are 16 megawatts that's operating today, but the designs are growing to 20 and to 25 megawatts right now. And what that means is you have to lift bigger turbines and you have to handle bigger turbines at port facilities. And so that creates a lot of issues as you design a port facility, so it's not obsolete as you build it. Going back to Maine a little bit, the reason we got into offshore wind close to 15 years ago is fossil fuel prices went up to $4 a gallon close to 15 years ago. We were in a crisis mode in Maine because we heat with oil. And so what we started looking at is using offshore wind, floating wind, to help heat homes in Maine using heat pumps and fill up cars, if you wish. So we put a plan together, and in 2013 we deployed the first offshore wind turbine in the United States. It was designed and built by our lab. And then next year, we're going to put another turbine in the water using a new design. And in 26, we'll put yet another single turbine in the water. And in 2030, 31, we're going to put an array that has 10 turbines. And then beyond 2030, we hope we're going to have commercial farms in the mid 2030s. We call our plan 110, 100. In other words, we're going to start with single turbine, then go put 10 in the water, then put 100 up there. So it's crawl before you walk, walk before you run, so we can develop an equitable industry that doesn't damage the environment and that doesn't damage the fisheries in the state and takes care of native communities' concerns and so forth. So that's the way we're proceeding in Maine with a 110-100 plan. I'll show you the first unit we deployed 10 years ago, last month. That's a 1:8 scale version of a full-size unit. And you could see, even though it's 1:8 scale, it's not tiny. You could see the people under that. We built it at the university and then in pieces and assembled that in Brewer, Maine, and then towed it down the Penobscot River in Maine, as you see right here. And we moored it off Castine, Maine. This is a lighthouse, beautiful spot in Maine. If you've never been to Maine, Castine is a place you want to visit. And we had an undersea cable that connects the unit to shore. And this is what it looked like in the very first major storm. This is called Winter Storm Electra. It was on December 15th, 2013. And what you see blown across is snow. Okay, this is not wind or clouds, that's snow. And it was a 50-year return period storm relative to the size of the hull. And you could see the white caps and the size of the hull. So in the real world, a 50-year wave in the Gulf of Maine is 60 feet from peak to trough. So this thing is being subjected to equivalent 60-foot waves, and you don't see it move. So it does work. So we can survive 50-year storms with floating turbines and 500-year storms. We know how to do that today. We weren't sure 15 years ago and 10 years ago, but we know how to do this today. And so what we're up to right now is building 2 single turbine projects, and that's what our turbine looks like, or the hull looks like. It's made out of concrete. We call it Volturnus. The reason we chose concrete is because we can make it locally and keep the jobs local, and because it lasts longer in the corrosive environment. So we hope in California you'll be looking at similar technologies as well, so you can keep the jobs local for the hulls. How do you connect the cable to shore? Typically, each turbine would have a cable that comes down from the turbine, down the tower, down the side of the hull, and then down to the seabed. And it makes what we call a lazy S-curve. And the lazy S-curve has buoyancy modules on the electric cable so that it will follow the turbine as the turbine moves around, because the turbine is moored to the seabed like a ship is. When the wind and waves come from different directions, the turbine will move around to go downwind and downwave. And therefore the electrical cable has to follow it. So we call that the dynamic cable. So we have a piece of the cable that makes this lazy S-curve. It's then fixed to the seabed and it continues on beyond that. In California, those water depths are 3,000 feet that you have to deal with. So this is not a simple dynamic cable to deal with. What does a cable look like? You can use a cable or you could use a chain. And to give you a sense of scale for what we're doing in Maine, that's a 6-foot human being. That's the size of one link in the chain, okay? And that's the size of a synthetic mooring line that could be used instead of a steel chain line. We're focused on synthetic mooring lines in Maine because they have a smaller footprint. But notice when people say, what's it going to do to the whales? The answer is it won't, because the whales will not get entangled in anything this big. And this is like a telephone pole. The whale won't get wrapped around it. So people ask that question a lot. Typically, what you want to do is bury the cable under the water, so in the mud, and if you can, and you do cable surveys and get around rock outcrops, so you can bury the cable 6 feet or more if you can. Typically, one advantage of floating wind turbines is people don't necessarily have to look at them, because you can put them far enough from shore that you don't see them from land. And that's one advantage of floating wind, that you don't have the visual effect. Our main research array that we plan to build will have 10 to 12 turbines, 15 megawatt each, and that will be constructed in 2030-31. Why 2030-31 is because we need to build a port first to build this. And it takes a few years to build a port, as you know. And that's why it's going to be 2030-31. Otherwise, we're ready to go faster, but without a port, we can't build it. And so there's a big need for floating ports. We've been designing different ports in Maine and to try to build one. And they're not cheap. You're looking at a minimum of $250 to $500 million to build a port. It could be quite a bit more than that as well. And the bigger the port is, of course, the faster you can assemble and build turbine and deploy them. And I know in Humboldt Bay, and our colleagues there are studying that very, very, very effectively, as well as, of course, in the Port of LA. So in terms of summary here, what are the opportunities and challenges for floating wind? Well, the good news is floating wind right now is mainstream. It's a US shot. And California can do 25 gigawatts by 2045, but that requires significant planning. The Inflation Reduction Act is a plus. What are the big issues with California? You have very deep waters, so that adds cost and adds risk for these designs. You have earthquakes to contend with that could liquefy the soils and undermine the foundations. The question is, if you're going to get 25 gigawatts, how would you develop a local supply chain to maximize the local jobs and train people on time to do all of this? You also need port facilities, just like we do in Maine and other parts of the world. And that's a key. I tell everybody, we need a Marshall Plan for ports in the United States for this to work. So in terms of an advocate group, Megan, is focusing on really developing a Marshall Plan for US ports to make this, this vision a reality is key for us. We don't have enough funding at the federal level to build the ports that we need to build. And that's a big challenge to get us there. We need to also plan for recycling these units after they're done. What do we do with them? That's really important. We can't just let the next generation worry about them. And then we need to also figure out how to speed permitting, but at the same time, truly protect the environment, the local stakeholders, the fisheries and indigenous communities that are key to all of this. So it was really a great pleasure to have an opportunity to talk to you. And I wish you all the luck in California and look forward to opportunities to collaborate. So.
Dr. Habib, thank you. Dr. Habib, Dagher, we so appreciate that your technical expertise and kind of seeing the videos and what they look like. I think it's really super helpful. So we know that you have to leave before the end of this webinar. Thank you for offering to answer questions that pop up in the Q&A. So if anybody had a question specifically for Dr. Dagher, please go ahead and write those into our Q&A segment. And now we're going to hear from the Honorable Mike Wilson, Humboldt County Supervisor. In addition to his public service, he's an environmental engineer and scientist, the board chair of Civic Well, formerly known as the Local Government Commission, which is where I met him. And he is a California Coastal Commissioner representing the North Coast. Supervisor Wilson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Can you hear me? Let me see if I share my screen here. Let's see how go.
As you do that, Megan, did you want me to answer the questions now or wait, or how would you like to?
You can go ahead and type them in. If you can type them into the chat, that would be great.
All right,
thank you so much.
Is my screen sharing? Can you see that? Because I can't see it.
I can see, talks about the Biden-Harris administration.
Yeah. So I just have to say, Frankenstein a bit of a PowerPoint here, you know, this morning, because to kind of specifically address this. And actually, as Dr. Habib was going through his slides, I actually took out some slides on mine so to not repeat so anyways, yeah, my name is Mike Wilson. I am Humboldt County Supervisor for 3rd District here in Northern California. Humboldt County is about the size of, you know, it's a little smaller than Connecticut with a population of 140,000 people. So it's a very rural and very, I would say, isolated place. It takes, we're, you know, 5.5 to 6 hours north of San Francisco by driving and probably 8 hours south of Portland. So this is a fairly remote section of the coast of California. I am the Governor Newsom's appointment to the California Coastal Commission, if you're familiar with that organization. And so, as you can imagine, offshore wind has been an issue that's been here with us for a while, and something I've been working on. And I'll be kind of talking about from a local governance perspective, and just put forward like the push, is kind of the bigger push from the way we see it here comes from the state and federal level. And sort of the, you know, trying to meet ambitious goals with relationship to climate change. And then as a community, I would say in transition, not transition from, but transition to a renewable energy economy. It's definitely, at the local level, we have a lot of things we have to deal with. So let's see, I'm gonna see if I can get my slides moving here. So let's see here. Slide move. Can you see that? No. Why is my, hold on. There we are. Okay. Great. Okay. So as the doctor said, that, you know, that you can see that on the West Coast, this is, you know, wind power resource. We are right up in this zone here where it's the darkest spot on this map. This is like the best, you know, wind resource on the continental U.S. pretty much in this zone, and also in Southern Oregon. So that's where we are on that map. Hold on a second here. This is, offshore wind lease for Humboldt County here is in Northern California. You can see there's one of the lease areas. This is the Humboldt one. This is the Morro Bay is in central California, I guess you'd call it. Some people like to call San Francisco Northern California, but you can see from this map, we refer to it as Central California. But in any case, you can see where those leases are occurring, and then the planned next leases are in Oregon as well. So this has a pretty profound impact to our communities here on the North Coast. Again, a photograph of what these things look like, more or less, and you saw the photos from before. Well, we might see sort of offshore, and again, the sites that we're talking about are 20 miles offshore. So because they're 20 miles offshore, and as Dr. Habib was talking about, like the impacts from a visual perspective, we won't be as impactful as one might imagine, although certainly they can be seen, and certainly there are perspectives around that I think Councilmember Williams will get into a bit more than I will today. And so you can see that the turbines are connected together with an electrical cable, and it comes to onshore substation. Here you can see the size of the auctions as relevant to our communities, and that's about 20 miles offshore. And you can see what that is relative to this community of Humboldt Bay. And that's about, the bay is about 10 miles long, I'd say. That's basically what it is. So you can, for scale. What we're expecting in terms of, or that may happen, or that's programmed to happen, is the lease auctions happen in 22. So the next 4 years are site assessments, surveys, environmental analysis. And then in 27, we'll be reviewing, not we, but the United States and through BOEM will be reviewing construction operation plans. And if all is kind of going according to plan, 2930 fabrication and construction, which would have to happen in a port, talk about in a minute. And then we'll see implementation around 2030. I think this is very bold, but this is it's as was said, it's an earth shot sorts. Harbor development. So this is really in our community where probably the biggest impacts will be, where the biggest interface will be. Oftentimes we think of wind energy as being on the tops of these ridges and the mountains that you see, or across the plains, kind of over there, or out in the ocean. But in this case, the centroid of our population and our community is based, in terms of the density of our population, right there in the harbor. And the construction of these, most people often think that the construction of these will happen like they're lying down and you bring them out to the ocean and stand them up, but it's not how it works. They get constructed in bay. And so this is something that even just my community is really just beginning to become aware of. We've been talking about it for a long time, but people haven't been able to really visualize that necessarily. And so we're just really beginning. As a matter of fact, last night was the notice of preparation first community meeting for the Harbor District for their EIR CEQA process. So that was just starting last night. Just kind of giving you a bit of scale in terms of the landscape. This is not where we are. Matter of fact, I don't even know where this is, but I think it's in Europe someplace. But it's just sort of give an outline what some of the thoughts are with relationship to the wind industry opportunity. 14,000 potential direct construction jobs, 20 to 50 billion in state GDP growth, shipyard infrastructure and investment, and ship construction, the revitalized industrial port areas. I agree with Dr. Habib about the Marshall Plan with relationship to this, because the way that this keeps getting talked about is, oh, we'll just build these ports and then the communities will just deal with the issue around infrastructure, housing, all the other things. And if you think about what the Marshall Plan was doing, and if you think about the shipyards when we were building, battleships to fight World War II, these are like, they built towns, right? And towns worth of infrastructure to support that. And so that is the narrative that oftentimes I have to bring back to my federal compatriots, in Washington, D.C., is that when we built the Hoover Dam, you build a whole town to support that. So this is like, in the kind of that earthshot language, this is really like the Cape Canaveral of offshore wind. You're building things that are as big as rockets, with technology not so far off from that then will be launched from these facilities. Almost science fiction in the size and scale with relationship to our landscape, for sure. Let's see here. Why is this blanking out all of a sudden? Let's see, come on. Oh, here we are. Oops. Is it just taking a while? Okay, so this is sort of the scale. This is the city of Eureka, which is the biggest city. It's the county seat. My office I'm sitting in is right about here on the map, and in this area is where the offshore terminal site will likely be constructed. It is the Humboldt Bay Harbor Recreation Conservation District, which I was a board member of for 11 years and was the chair when we actually purchased this land here, which is an old mill site. So it's an old, not just mill site, but then in the 60s was created into pulp mills. So there was so this was all industrial. It's about 800 acres or so of industrial lands that were both the site of two large, very polluting pulp mills after the timber mills died. And then also you see the town of Samoa. Again, when the first mills were created, they created towns adjacent to them to support the workforce to be in those spaces. So this is something we're having to continuously talk about. This is a concept with relationship to how the site would be used. Again, you can see the town of Samoa in that space there, which is a small old mill town that is now the lots have been subdivided and are being sold off. Coincidentally, or those lots are being sold off privately, but again, as we all have housing crisis, where we are part of our housing crisis, it can be the short-term rental issues, right, with relationship to Airbnb. And half of those houses are being used for Airbnb or will be, you know, and so this is an issue with relationship to housing that could be supporting these workforces. And again, that's sort of latent bad policy on the part of my board. I'll put it that way. Anyways, so you can see this is the site. You can see the town. You can even see this is where we have low-income housing in that area adjacent to the site. So again, we have to like think about the equity issues around port development and who it's most impacting and how those impacts are happening. I have to tell you, I was a port commissioner for 11 years. I toured a lot of ports. I would see a lot of very highly impacted communities adjacent to ports. These ports would always be talking about the economic benefits, but somehow they just didn't quite make it across the street. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for all of our port facilities as we move forward, is to not have that be the model and really create opportunity in these spaces. So again, this is kind of what it might look like in that zone. Again, it's right adjacent to our biggest town, and these are 1,000 feet tall. So even in the current context, I mean, the largest smokestack that we have from the old mill sites are 300 feet tall. They are right now landmarks in and of themselves. And when you let people know that the structures that will be adjacent to those will be 3 times taller, they definitely think about that a little bit. Again, it's kind of an aesthetic. We drive by gas stations every day, and those don't seem to bother us. And so, you know, it's one of those things we have to probably rethink about what we think is an aesthetic. In any case, this is sort of a scale. So one of the reasons Humboldt Bay is considered very valuable for this, or, you know, is not just that we have all of this land that's former industrial land, but we don't have a bridge at our entrance of our bay, right? So San Francisco Bay has a bridge, which makes these, you know, getting these out very difficult. And so this is one of the values of Humboldt Bay, is not having a bridge, because you can see in the current context, the turbine that's next to the Eiffel Tower is about the size that we're talking about now for being deployed. Let's see here. I'm gonna get my cursor in the right spot. Come on, somehow this is slow here. Oh, yep. Okay, so you can see the dates on there. All right, so this is like, you know, scale, someone else's bay, not ours, with a turbine that's, you know, superimposed upon there. This is totally fake, but understanding like what it means to have it be in the community. Let's see here. So I think there was a question about transmission. That is really a huge issue for this project. If the full array is installed, we could be talking about, oh, I don't know, 200 gigawatts or something to that effect. And so trying to figure out the transmission out of our area is extremely difficult over mountains, in the ocean. All of them are, you know, $1 billion and more projects going across all kinds of communities and lands and tribal areas, and well, everywhere is a tribal area, but you understand what I'm getting at. It can have both environmental and cultural impacts, and so we're looking at different ways to do that and different technologies, and that is definitely one of the big ones. But although the first phase of what we're looking at for Humboldt Bay is probably about 15 turbines, and that would actually cover our area. Right, it's then the next phase that would elicit that stuff. So, oops, hold on. So, local government lens. This is like community and transition to renewable energy future. When I was in Washington, D.C. last month with both labor and tribal representatives talking about these issues, you know, there's a lot of discussion about communities in transition, the just transition, and about communities moving away from fossil fuels, you know, coal and those other things. And we were really talking about our community as a community in transition towards something, and the impacts around that. I put tribal and cultural concerns on here, but I know that Councilmember Williams can speak more to that, so I was gonna defer. And so the policy considerations we're really dealing with now are community benefits agreements around this, project labor agreements we're in negotiations with. There's legislation. I have SB 286, which basically removes a lot of local control around these issues and gives it to the state in order to fast track. And this is controversial, of course, with local governments, as you can imagine. Economic issues, equitable job and supply chain access, community infrastructure requirements, and I was speaking to that. So even the place where the locale where this is going to be built, like this, the wastewater treatment plant, right, isn't built necessarily. I literally have a community services district with volunteers trying to find $30 million to deal with this, right? That shouldn't be happening. If the federal government and the state really prioritizes this, they need to step up and provide that town's worth of infrastructure to support this transition. Housing is huge. We're already at net housing, net zero, less than zero, right? We already have a housing crisis now. How are we going to adapt to this increase in folks coming here? And then there's the fishing fleet concerns, which you can imagine, both transitioning out in the ocean, but with relationship to traffic in the bay, where their resources are, where they load and unload, and all those other things. And then there's the localized environmental impacts, birds, port development, and we're having discussions around what is a green port, what are the emissions of the port facility itself and its safety with relationship to our local community, and the noise and all those things. Maritime marine upwelling is an issue, upland landscape issues, and I talked about that with relation to the transmission port, and then view sheds. All of those impacts, I have to remind people often, is in context with the impact of climate change, right? I mean, that is, we are so focused often on the localized impacts, we lose track of the local impacts that we are already having due to climate change and what we're going to do in our future and how we're going to address that. And so that's the sum total of my talk for now, and then I'll be able to answer questions. And hopefully I didn't go too long.
Really appreciate that, Supervisor. Appreciate your perspectives. And Cheryl, I just typed in the chat, if we have a Q&A section, please feel free to type your questions there. We are going to now transition over to Honorable Phillip Williams, Tribal Council Member for the Yurok tribe, California's largest tribe with over 6,000 enrolled members. It has an ancestral territory along the Klamath River. He represents the North District. And we're also grateful that he serves on both EOPA's California Leadership Council and our National Leadership Council. Councilmember Williams, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I forgot I was supposed to wait 3 seconds, right?
You're good.
Yeah, as Megan mentioned, I'm North District Council Member of the Yurok tribe. Supervisor Wilson, I spent some time in his district working in the local sawmills, like you mentioned earlier when I was a young man. You know, offshore wind has been a big topic over the last few years, and it's raised some eyebrows at the Yurok tribe. Some things that are common is that we need these jobs. We need this economic development in our communities. In Humboldt, I represent Del Norte. Both communities are in desperate need of economic development. You know, our salmon have declined. Loss of our fisheries, loss of our timber industry. And even now, you know, up here in the north, you know, the Pelican Bay prison is one of our #1 employers up here. And that's been, you know, under fire, let's say. But what we can agree on also is the need for alternative energies, clean energy. And that's where the Yurok tribe is really looking at this hard. We know that climate change is impacting us all. But up here in the north in a rural area, we're being impacted by the droughts, by the wildfires. And up here we have lack of just basic food needs. We don't have grocery stores on my reservation. Some of the things that are a little difficult to get around as a Yurok tribal member is we're talking about electrifying Southern California. This isn't coming to my community. This isn't going to electrify my community. It's going to electrify Southern California. And there's a hypocrisy in that I want to speak about. We have areas of our reservation that still don't have electricity. We have areas of our reservation that still don't have reliable water. Our community has been overlooked for hundreds of years. And yet we're being asked to advocate and sign on for this to go through when I got people that still don't have internet. They don't have reliable phone service. They don't have access to education. They don't have access to things that many of us, we do every day. There's no Domino's Pizza up there. There's no McDonald's up there. There's not even a 7-Eleven there. But at the same time, we still see the value of clean energy. Most recently, though, we've been able to, we're creating microgrids up in our areas that don't have reliable electricity. The local government, the state government, and federal government has also given us funding to give reliable internet service to our upriver communities. So we're making progress. Through some of this other funding, we were able to improve our school system up there where there's no 50 students in the school. They're overlooked constantly. With some of the recent funding, we were able to rebuild those schools. So those children up there can like, again, once again, I say, what we take for granted every day, we have a group of people that don't have those things. The Yurok tribe, you know, we're a natural resources tribe. We don't have a gaming facility. We don't have, we're trying to build an economy right now. Our people have been devastated by extraction of our natural resources. Talk about the gold rush. Some people don't like to talk about that. Our river has been devastated by pollution, environmental terrorism, I'll call it. Choked our rivers off. Not to mention, we just now fought for the largest dam removal in American history. And those dams will be coming down here in next year, which was another supposed to provide electricity. So there's some concerns that we at the tribe want to know. Are we going to be fighting offshore wind in 20 years because of whatever arises, complications, whatever? The same thing that happened with the dams. They eventually outlasted themselves. They weren't providing enough electricity for the value it was to maintain them. Those dams didn't get taken down because of the kindness of somebody's heart. That was a money issue where they were no longer sustainable for what the output was. So it wasn't like somebody did a great idea philanthropic event on our behalf. It was money. We recognize that this offshore wind is about money. And I'll tell you, my initial reaction was we were getting rolled over We weren't being respected. We've seen this playbook before. Through the gold rush, through the dams, through our water fights. We see the federal government come and roll over on us, push all this on us. And then our citizens have to bear that. The weight of those decisions are on our people, the people that elected me. You know, there are issues regarding our fish, our salmon. You know, we have a small fleet of fishermen. You know, that's going to impact their fishing area. Right now, we had to shut our salmon season down because we didn't have the minimum amount of spawning adults to allow our people to eat salmon. We wonder about how is that going to affect our salmon fishery. Some of the other issues that we at the Yurok tribe wonder about, maybe I don't really think anybody else looks at the landscape like we do. Our religion tells us that our ancestors, when we leave this realm, their spirit goes out into the ocean. In the 1855 treaty, the Yurok tribe did not cede its rights to the ocean. We maintain that's always been ours. We build canoes, ocean-going canoes. We used to hunt whales. We hunt seals. When we go up into the high country, you can see these floating turbines from the high country. See, in our religion, we go up to the highest points and we pray to the Creator for the balance of the world. We pray that everybody gets what they need out of this life. Food, water, also your spirit gets fed. That's why it's important for the tribes to have input. We offer another perspective. We've been caretaker of this land since the beginning of time. And most recently, science is starting to show that our management practices are way better than what the colonial people brought over. You realize that we used to burn this landscape, and the first contact peoples didn't understand why we did that. And it's just now, with all these wildfires, they're figuring out, oh, they were correct. The native people were correct. You maintain the land with fire. You know, we are, some of the other issues that concern the Yurok tribe. We talk about the transmission lines. It's our duty to preserve our sacred sites, our sacred ceremonial sites. Some of the areas that you have proposed, see, that place wasn't always underwater. There are ancient villages beneath the waves. I am concerned about that. Concerned about the pillaging of our artifacts. It's important that the Yurok tribe people have a hand in the monitoring when they start breaking ground, when you start finding our artifacts and our villages underwater. You know, the Yurok tribe is not just a backwoods tribe. We're very, very progressive. We're working on economic developments, whether this offshore wind goes or doesn't go or whatever happens. We have other irons in the fire. We have construction companies. We have corporations. We're doing river restoration projects where we're the experts on restoring the habitat. We have engineers. We have technicians. We have scientists. We have biologists. We have master's degrees within our membership. We have a lot to offer. You know, what we're asking for at the Yurok tribe is to have a voice. We're asking to be a part of the decision making. We're asking not to be drowned out either. We don't want our voice to be diluted. I think eventually we'll be starting to seek a partnership with local tribes. That's our next step, to come together as a whole conglomerate of tribes and see what we are going to do to preserve our sacred sites. You know, we, with our corporations, we want to drive a project. We want to be the drivers. We already are across America with our 8A contracting. We're already doing these things. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for, if we're going to be on this, we want to be a driver. We want to maintain, provide economic development opportunities for the next generations, not the short term, long term. I think that's groundbreaking if this were to happen. We have 6,400 tribal members. I'm interested to see, as this develops, the impacts on the environment. I think a lot of us on North Coast, not just tribes, all the communities are wondering what's going to happen. How is this going to affect our communities? As Supervisor Wilson talked about, we have a housing shortage here. You're going to have to buy it. You're basically going to have to create a whole town out of nothing. You know, we got partnerships with the local colleges. All the promises are there for our people to get these opportunities. I'm really happy that they're going the extra mile. But I have to convince my community, the people that elected me, that this is a good thing. But I've got a lot of good feedback from my community about they want to transition off of fossil fuels. They're interested in the clean energy also, but at what cost? You know, us Yurok people, we're taught there's a cost we won't pay if it impacts our fish, our lives, our livelihood, our natural resources. We don't want that money. We've seen what that's done to our people. We're not willing to go there. Some of the other tribes I've heard have been offered one-time payouts. We're not doing that. We ain't doing that. We want to be the driver. We want to be a player. And I don't just speak for the Yurok people, I also represent the Del Norte community. Because that next one is coming right up in that area also. in the Brookings, Crescent City area, right off of there. I'll finally close with saying, I and many of my constituents hope that we can find ways around some of these issues. I would like to ask Supervisor Wilson, you know, there is something that I'm currently interested in about the sacred site of Tulawa Island in Humboldt Bay. That's a sacred site. How are we going to mitigate that? The massacre of a whole village was right there, an ancient village. Pretty close to where that new port's going to be developed. I am very interested to see how that's going to be mitigated, because that's a big issue. And that will set the tone of how are we going to mitigate the other sacred sites that are uncovered in the future. Anyway, I'll close with saying, I think we'll all look at this as an opportunity to move it in the future. There's just some barriers, some issues that are going to come up that we need to figure out a way to work through. Thank you for having me, Megan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Councilmember Williams. I want to thank you for grounding us in this, you know, deeper reflection on like the history, the, you know, where we've been and how we need a big paradigm shift in how we create and energy resources, and how we authentically listen to one another and respect one another and learn from one another and give each other space to be the drivers and not just on the receiving end of a colonialist mindset. So I just really want to thank you for bringing that to this space. Last but not least, we are going to hear from my friend, Honorable Eduardo Martinez, the mayor of Richmond. Mayor Martinez is a former teacher who has led some really transformational environmental justice work in Richmond as a council member starting in 2014, and now as mayor. Thank you so much for joining us, Mayor Martinez.
Thank you for having me. I want to also thank the former speaker for highlighting the fact that all voices need to be heard. Just at our last council meeting where we had the community out to speak about the need for soccer fields, in which all the council members were in agreement with, we had one council member remind us that the neighborhood councils also have to have a voice in where and when the soccer fields should be put in. So it's important that all voices be heard. I have been mayor for 6 months, and stepping into my role as mayor, we heard of the offshore wind industry coming to the West Coast. And so we found that we were not included in the initial calling of ports. So we lobbied to get our name put in there so that we could be part of the players. There's enough work for all ports to be part of the new economy that will be coming. And I also want to mention several speakers who mentioned a Marshall Plan being essential to make this happen. And the Marshall Plan came about as a result of mass destruction. And so we continue to spend a lot of our economy on weapons of destruction, and we need to change that economy and put it into constructive endeavors. And I see this offshore wind energy being one of those endeavors. I was really fascinated and impressed with the work that they're doing in Maine. And when I saw what they've done, what I was amazed about was the amount of capital that was required in order to accomplish what they did. And so if you look at the Richmond port, you'll see that we are underdeveloped port that needs lots of finances in order to become useful again. We have a bridge that keeps us from doing a lot of stuff, but there are a lot of ancillary opportunities. And one of the ones that we want to focus on is workforce development. We have a high school that's has a very strong STEM program. And so we are trying to establish a maritime academy at the port where they can graduate from the high school STEM program over to the Maritime Academy. We have a lot of people who can step into the new jobs. As many of you know, the city of Richmond was the center of the Victory ship building during World War II. And so I have this vision of reviving Rosie the Riveter by stepping into the shipbuilding aspect of this process. And so you know, I know that there's specialty ships that need to be built for this industry, and I think it would be economically viable to have them built here in the state in the city of Richmond. So we are coordinating we want to coordinate with other ports to figure out which sections of this industry is best suited for each port. You know, as you heard, Humboldt is best suited for building the actual windmills, and I see Richmond as being shipbuilding and workforce development. And later on, we can also be a place that does repair and servicing of the ships. We have the support of our federal representative, John Garamendi, you know, who's excited by this. We are in touch with academies in Washington, and our sister city, Joshan, is also, we learned, looking into the offshore wind. They have a maritime academy there. We will be going there in October to have conversations with them about how we might cooperate with the Chinese offshore wind efforts. So we're at the very beginning. We're trying to figure out sources of income to make this happen. We've had various developers come to the Port of Richmond to see what the opportunities are. And let me see if I can, I have a map of the Maine port. If I can show the screen. Well, we have rail lines that go directly to the port, which is makes in and out of materials easy. So can you show me how to share that screen? Oh, there. Yeah, there we go.
Thanks for the tech support, BK.
Anything for the mayor? You should be connected.
Okay, so do you see the port photo? Or
Yes.
no? Yeah. Okay. So this is the rail line that comes in, and we have all this area here that is available for laying out. We have a place up here where the training will be, and then we have some slips here where we could have shipbuilding. So the developers have said that this actually is a very attractive space, and that we shouldn't have much difficulty finding people who would be interested in collaborating with the city of Richmond on this. This port is owned by the city of Richmond, so all activities would be coming through the city government. So it's not complicated. We are in search of a new port director who has a vision of developing the port. And part of the development would be electrification of the port. So BK, do you have anything you would like to add?
No, we know that we have the port for it, and we know that all ports need work. There are no turnkey, ready to go ports at this time, but we're willing to take the time, the investment. We're exploring all opportunities to see where we best fit in. We're under the understanding that it is a collaborative. This will be a team effort where there's enough work to go around. As the mayor said, World War II, the city answered the call for war. Now we want to answer the call for the environment. And being a green city, we think this is a great opportunity for us to fit into that.
Well said. Thank you. So we are a blue collar city, and we're ready to answer the call for the workforce. So I know we're running late, so I will cut it at that and be open for questions.
Thank you so much, Mayor Martinez. Really appreciate it. We have just a few minutes for Q&A. I want to thank our earlier guest, Dr. Habib Dagher, who had to leave, and we had asked him to answer some questions in advance, and he's been typing away, answering a lot of the questions. And thank you, Supervisor Wilson, for answering questions as well. If you do have questions, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. I have a couple open questions that have not been answered yet from Hope Kahan. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. The San Francisco Bay Area is very familiar with the benefits of PLAs, project labor agreements. However, other states such as Maine may not understand these benefits and the ability to provide jobs locally if a PLA is required. Is there work being done nationally on this to create the space for PLAs on wind turbine projects? I don't know if that's too in the weeds for any of our guests, but if any of the panelists wanted to take a stab at answering that or talk about PLAs that you're working on.
Yeah, I can jump in. Oh, never mind. We'll let someone else.
No, go ahead.
I'll just say that from our region, certainly all the related labor unions are at the table right now with relationship to PLAs. And when we had a proposed wind project on land a couple years ago, it really became a big issue. I would say a lot of that is being driven by state legislation, excuse me, related to the actual funding. So where we might have some be supportive in our community, and I have to tell you, there's certainly our private side, non-union labor community is having, you know, some issues around that. A lot of it appears, will be probably driven by state funding and requirements of state funding to have those PLAs. I will say that the PLAs and the unions here have been very supportive around language for local hires, but also they've been very, very supportive for DEIJ requirements as well, and have been doing a lot more lately to reach out to tribal communities as well. And a lot of the local labor unions here have a pretty significant tribal membership, if not members themselves have family members or affiliations within that labor force. And that really actually speaks to our strong tribal presence within the community in general.
And one of the things about the port being owned by the city of Richmond is that the city of Richmond has an ordinance that requires PLAs to be in order to have any work contract with the city. So all wind activity within the city of Richmond would have to have a PLA.
That's great. Thank you, Mayor. We have a question from Doug B, who asks, is anyone looking at the potential for converting or otherwise utilizing military bases to provide port facilities for offshore wind? This ought to be a national security issue, and DOD does consider the climate as a national security issue. And DOD Department of Defense should find a way to make room for these needs. Is that something that anybody has looked at or has familiarity with?
Well, I will say that part of the limitations for the siting of offshore wind in the central part in Southern California was limitations around military requirements in places they just didn't want to have those structures, that they viewed them as an impediment to national security, and for whatever reasons that they may be. We don't really have a lot of military bases per se coastally that have port facilities anywhere north of San Francisco that I'm aware of that have anything of any significance. So
great, thank you. We have another attendee, Laura, who herself is a policy expert, and so if the team can make her a panelist real quick. Laura is mentioning one of the important statewide bills, AB 80 by Assemblymember Addis, to establish a new regional research hub. So I'm wondering if we can bring her on real quick as a panelist to talk about that specifically. I think I see her icon. Laura, did you want to talk about AB 80?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I noticed one of the questions in the Q&A was from Elizabeth Dia, who had the concern about, with so many big infrastructure projects related to offshore, what are the impacts going to be on, like, surely there'll be cumulative impacts potentially on the environment. And I think that's exactly right. Oh wait, sorry, I'm trying to join at the same time. Are you guys able to see me now? Hi there. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Dehan, State Director for Environment California, and we do a lot of work in support of going big on offshore wind and also making sure we do it in a way that's really responsible and prioritizes protecting wildlife as well as other concerns. And AB 80 is a bill that was authored by Assemblymember Don Addis, who represents the Central Coast of California. And that bill would require the establishment of a regional research hub that would actively monitor and study the impacts of this burgeoning industry in the state. And there's something really similar on the East Coast that exists, but we don't yet have it on the West Coast. So that's why we need that bill, AB 80, to pass this session. So Environment California supports that bill. It's sponsored by the Monterey Bay Aquarium and also the Natural Resources Defense Council. So they're doing really good work there. And there's actually a number of other bills that are actively moving that are going to help address some of the issues that came up today, from a bill by Assemblymember Dagher from the Santa Monica LA area that would really work to make sure we're ready to transform our ports, and that the state is actively making the plan to ready our ports, the port cities, for to be able to support these massive huge turbines that we're going to be needing to get built and supported, and also that we do it in a way that really encourages the development of lots of local jobs. So Environment California sponsoring that one, and many other groups are really supporting it. And then there's opportunity as well there's a discussion right now about a new climate bond, and that could be a source of resources to help fund this important transformation work.
Laura, thank you so much. We really appreciate that perspective and that look on, what we can do on a statewide level, and some of the protections and funding that's needed to do it responsibly. As we wrap up, I'm going to give a voice to the last question from our friend, former Councilmember Cheryl Davila, who thanks Mayor Martinez and asks if you can get Chevron to assist with building the port and transition their workforce. Of course, Richmond is a refinery town, and the leadership in Richmond has done so much to protect its people. If you, Mayor Martinez, want to answer that question about, that just transition for workers and how the path forward.
I was on the picket line with Local 5, and one of the people on the picket line was the president of the union, who was fired, and he now works with my office, and I believe that he would be better equipped to give an answer to that. BK?
Yes, to speak to the just transition of the workers, I'm the individual who was fired, president on the picket line there. The just transition for the workers, we have a lot of conversations going on now, and we're trying to see how that would look. We want it not to just be employment, but it has to be employment that sustains a certain standard of living that all workers deserve. We're in the midst of working through several bills to get money to transition that and make sure that green jobs aren't low-paying jobs that people would not want. So we're currently working on that initiative throughout the state of California. As far as getting Chevron, I don't think that's part of I don't think they'll be part of our port. No, I don't think that's going to happen.
BK, thank you so much for that. That's really important perspective. And Cheryl, thank you for your question. Well, really appreciate everybody for attending. Thank you so much to our extraordinary panelists and the perspectives they've all brought, and Laura for coming in to talk about statewide policy. Once again, if you have not already signed our offshore wind letter, we'll repost it in the chat and encourage everybody to sign it along with our national climate emergency letter. if our panelists can stick with us for just a second after we close this webinar, we would appreciate it to wrap up with you all. And I want to thank everybody for showing up and for your interest in this topic.